Joseph Tartaglia here for Philadelphia Mayor, and I'm doing a video exposing left-wing propaganda. Now, I was going to do one a little bit later down the line, but since I got a viewer request, I'm going to do it a little bit early. Now, before we get into this, it's important that you know that this video involves the topic of abortion. However, this video is not meant to promote any opinion on the subject, but it's for the purpose of exposing the dishonesty that the left-wing propaganda presents in the situation as a whole.
At the highest levels of the Republican Party, there's all this talk recently about how reasonable they're going to be about abortion. Nikki Haley talking about humanizing her position, to Donald Trump portraying himself as a moderate, ludicrously, and pointing to exceptions as a way to sell Republican abortion bans, a sentiment echoed by other politicians. What do they actually do, though, when they have the power? What do they do? We can look. Here's a test case in Texas, a state with a near total ban on abortion controlled entirely by Republicans, with criminal penalties for doctors up to life in prison. And Kate Cox, she is 20 weeks pregnant. But doctors tragically just discovered the baby she is carrying has a rare genetic condition that will almost certainly result in a stillbirth or death soon after birth. Kate Cox asked a judge to make an exception to Texas law to allow her to get an abortion so she can protect her health and, crucially, also her future fertility, which is threatened. A judge, under extraordinary circumstances, agreed, issuing an order allowing her to obtain that medical care, and then immediately the Republican Attorney General Ken Paxton threatened to jail her doctor and sue the hospital or any hospital that performs it if they provide this abortion care. He is now petitioning the Texas Supreme Court to prevent Kate Cox from getting the reproductive care that her doctors say she needs, from getting an exception to the state's abortion ban.
What I just showed you were some key moments from the first video I watched on the topic of Kate Cox. I'm not going to go through the entire first video because it's about 7 minutes long, and taken at face value, there isn't anything about this video that seems to be dishonest. Considering that I didn't know much about the specifics of the abortion laws in Texas, knowing it's one of the states that has an outright ban on it, it's safe to assume that you might have to get legal permission in order to get an emergency abortion. And it makes it even easier to assume because it seems to be presented that way. So basically, from what I gathered from the first video is that Kate Cox went to get permission from the court to get an emergency abortion to prevent what her doctor said was going to either lead to a stillbirth or dying minutes after, and also could cause permanent reproductive problems for Kate. The judge ruled in her favor, giving her permission to get the abortion, exempting her from the ban. Immediately after that, the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, petitioned the Supreme Court of Texas to pause the approval of the abortion and threatened to have them arrested if they decided to go through with the procedure anyway. From what this first video suggests, it seems like a total retaliation against the decision to grant her access to the procedure. And it's hard to come off as anything but cruel on Ken's part. But it's when I got halfway past the second video I watched that something they brought up seemed oddly suspicious. But we will get to that in a little bit. For now, we're going to move on to the beginning of the second video I saw.
It's the Republican government at all levels, right? State level, telling a doctor and a pregnant woman she cannot receive the medical care she desperately needs. It is the nightmare scenario come true. There it is, right now, happening before our eyes. The nightmare scenario that proponents of abortion rights have warned about for 50 years. It just happened to Kate Cox in Texas, and it is coming for everyone. Make no mistake. This movement, the one that you just saw pursue control over Kate Cox's body to appeal to the state Supreme Court, to issue threatening letters to hospitals, that movement is not going to relent. They will never give up on their aims of exerting that level of control over every single woman's body in this country. Every voter in this country needs to understand that they could be Kate Cox, and everyone in this country needs to understand that they could be Kate Cox's loved one. Kate Cox could be in your family, and you could be going through that. And we all will be if Republicans remain in power and expand that power.
So we're about a minute into the second video, and there's something about it that seems off to me that I'm not seeing right away. But when it comes to left-wing propaganda specifically, they are very articulate on how they present it. There's obviously propaganda going on here in the sense they are clearly trying to provoke the opinion of the situation for their benefit, but are no direct indications that they are being dishonest. Anyway, he goes on to show President Joe Biden's address on the matter, along with other Republican politicians not answering the press's questions regarding the case. But I want to move on to the segment with Molly Duane, the senior staff attorney at the Center of Reproductive Rights, because this is where I start to notice some subtle anomalies.
What did she do in the last week and a half? She found a lawyer. She decided to file a lawsuit. She received an order.
Right there. Did you hear what she said? She mentions that Kate hired a lawyer and filed a lawsuit that led to her getting approved for the abortion. They made it seem like it was some sort of hearing prior to this. I know they didn't specifically say that it was a hearing, but they never mentioned a lawsuit prior to the approval being paused. Also, if the doctor considered this to be an emergency situation, why instead of waiting 3 days in agonizing pain, did she not just travel to a different state to get the procedure she needed? I understand that some people can't afford to do something like that, but she was financially capable of hiring a lawyer, so don't you think it would have been beyond her capability? I'm not suggesting that it would be ideal, but realistically, if she was at risk and was financially capable, would it be wise to do so?
She had the Texas Supreme Court say, no, we're going to put a hold on this. We need more time. And then she spent 3 agonizing days waiting for an answer before the Texas Supreme Court.
Right, I forgot. They paused that earlier ruling.
He forgot? There's no way that he forgot that they paused the initial ruling. The last video and this video so far up until this point has been specifically about that. Now, I understand that he's probably just trying to remind and provoke the audience of that detail in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way, but it's just kind of strange to do it at that time.
There's something so disingenuously bad faith about the court ruling, which basically says, Well, if you can get a medical, like if it's a medical necessity, they say a woman who meets the medical necessity exception need not seek a court order to obtain an abortion. Under the law, it is a doctor who must decide that a woman is suffering from a life-threatening condition during pregnancy. Basically saying like, oh, what do you mean court order? Go ahead if it's medically necessary. You have the Attorney General of the state writing to threaten this woman with a felony conviction.
This is where he revealed his hand. In under 20 seconds, he gave me all I needed to begin my dissection. I could not believe that after the Attorney General threatened to take legal action if she decided to seek the approved abortion, the court ruled that in an emergency situation, she was entitled to the abortion and are trying to trick her into getting herself arrested by saying, it's fine, go get it, it's not within our hands. Somebody isn't telling the truth here. So what we're going to do first is look at the Supreme Court case. Now, I'm going to go through this as briefly and efficiently as possible before getting back into the dissection because the context of this information I'm about to present right now is extremely important. So first we see that lawsuit that was mentioned by Molly Duane. Then it proceeds to mention what the lawsuit is about, which is an exemption from the abortion ban, followed by what is legally required in order to get that exemption. Now let's stop right here for a moment because this is going to be important later. This is the exemption requirements to the abortion ban in Texas. In the exercise of reasonable medical judgment, the pregnant female has a life-threatening physical condition aggraved by, caused by, or arise from a pregnancy that places the female at risk of death or poses a serious risk of substantial impairment of a majorly bodily function unless the abortion is performed or induced. Continuing along, it states that Kate's doctor never mentioned to the initial court that there was any life-threatening conditions nor any other conditions that requires her to have the exemption to the ban. Then it goes on to say they aren't doubting that there are life-threatening conditions that meet the requirements of the exemption, but since it wasn't brought up in the context of the trial, it doesn't meet the requirements. Then it says that the judge granted her approval without any legal requirements anyway, specifically stating that the Attorney General has a restraining order on the authority to enforce consequences to Kate, her husband, the doctor, and anyone else who was involved with the procedure. They bring up that she wrote it in a way where it was designed to try to make it so they can't put an appeal on it until the procedure is over, and that the judge is not supposed to do that, even for a brief period. They add on the trial court declared abortion laws unenforceable based on the opinion of the court that an exemption should apply there. And then it comes back to this, right where we began, where it states that a woman who seeks necessary medical exemption basically can't get one provided by the court, but only through doctors' reasonable medical judgment. And then it goes on to say that Kate's doctors said they have good faith belief and that meets the requirements to the exemption. However, the Supreme Court reiterates that good faith belief isn't the precedent on whether the decision is determined, but requires a reasonable medical judgment from someone who's medically certified, and that the judge basically doesn't have the authority to determine that decision by law. Kate's lawyer then suggests to them that all that means is that she needs to be inches away from death in order for her to get the treatment. The court then tells them that the exemption doesn't hold the doctor to medical certainty, suggesting that they could determine whether it's a medical emergency well before any life-threatening effects could take place, and pretty much if they're inaccurate, the courts don't penalize them for that. It also directly states that a pregnant woman does not need to seek court order to have a life-saving abortion in Texas. And this last part just clarifies the legal standards. Now that we have this new information, let's go back to the first video to see if there are any contradictions that we missed without this context.
Kate Cox asked a judge to make an exception to Texas law to allow her to get an abortion so she can protect her health and crucially also her future fertility, which is threatened.
Right here in the first video, he explains that Kate's doctor determined that there's a condition that poses a serious risk of substantial impairment of a major bodily function unless the abortion is performed or induced, that being the risk of her losing her fertility. So based on the law, which we went over before, this would qualify her for the exemption to the abortion ban. So why was this never mentioned in the original trial? I don't understand how such a crucial detail to this request was never brought up. If the request for an exemption was truly based on what he's saying in this video, then the exemption in theory would be approved, right? So why is this an issue? What is going on? If all she's trying to do is get an exemption for an emergency abortion with the legitimate reasoning that is supported by law, why is the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, threatening to pursue legal action against anyone who tries to give her that once she is approved by that judge? The only explanation is that Ken Paxton is completely corrupt and is abusing his political authority by intimidating Kate Cox with the threat of prison to force her to go through with a pregnancy in order to have complete, utter control over her reproductive rights and healthcare access. That's why there's no mention of the doctors claiming that they used reasonable medical judgment in the lawsuit. When Ken went to petition for the approval to be paused, he altered the details of the court case to make it seem like there was no mention of it, even though they did mention it. So my final conclusion is that Ken Paxton is a complete tyrant and wants to have women suffer and will stop at nothing in order to fulfill his agenda to make women second-class citizens and to rule his patriarchal theocracy with an iron fist. Now, as convenient as that may be, that's obviously not the real conclusion. You see, this propaganda goes further than any of us could have thought. What if I told you that Kate Cox might be lying about her situation? Before we continue, I just want to bring up that I don't think that Kate Cox is lying, and I don't want anybody harassing this person whatsoever. We are going to go more in depth into the situation, and there might be some things that people don't want to hear. So what's actually going on here is that Kate Cox simply just doesn't know the law. She then found herself in a very tragically unfortunate situation where she was 20 weeks into her pregnancy when she found out by her doctor that her baby wasn't going to make it and was either going to be a stillborn or die moments after the birth. There was also a possibility of her losing her fertility. Now, because there is a ban on abortion that is violated, could lead to a very hefty prison sentence, it has gotten everyone who works in the field and needing to use that field extremely paranoid when it comes to having to make a decision or get a procedure like that could also lead to those kind of consequences. Understandably, Kate Cox decided to get legal advice to help her in this very horrible situation. She hired Austin Kaplan, and he possibly gave her the single worst legal advice any lawyer could ever give anyone in the history of the law. Dr. Carson, also nervous about the legality of the situation, took the legal advice as well. The legal advice being that they should sue the state for having an abortion ban to begin with under the stipulation that it gets in the way of people getting necessary healthcare access. Now let's think about this element for a second. All she wanted was advice on the legality of her situation, and it led to a totally different legal scenario altogether. Why did this happen? Couldn't the lawyer simply advise them to just simply request permission on the basis of a life-altering consequence of this pregnancy? Let's go even further than that. Austin Kaplan is a lawyer, which means he is somebody who obviously knows a lot about the law. Wouldn't it have been better legal advice to tell Kate Cox, her husband, and the doctor something on the lines of, under the circumstance that you're using your reasonable medical judgment, that you are exempt from the ban on abortion, and that there isn't really anything to be worried about, because the law doesn't get to determine what is considered, that it would be up to the doctor, which is you, Dr. Kaplan. I understand your concern. This is a very serious decision, but rest assured, legally speaking, you are within your legal requirements to obtain an exemption for this procedure. If anything comes up of it, be sure to give me a call, and also do not disclose any information regarding anything pertaining to the situation until you speak to me. That would make a lot more sense for a lawyer to do something on the lines of that. But we all know the reasoning behind why he did not give such advice is because you make more money when you convince your client to go to court with you as the lawyer. Austin Kaplan is a civil rights lawyer, so convincing his clients are at risk of losing or have already lost their civil rights is something that he personally benefits from financially. So it makes sense why he would go as far as to say that instead of asking for an abortion within the requirements of what could be exempt, because he knows that they could do that without going to court, because he knows the law. So they go to trial with this lawsuit, and I can only imagine two reasons why the doctor didn't specifically bring up that they were using a reasonable medical judgment, because they probably were under the impression that if the court can prove that the person who is requesting the abortion somehow wasn't using a reasonable medical judgment, that they could get in trouble for perjury, so they probably said good faith belief to be safe. However, I also believe there's a high chance that the doctor themselves purposefully used those phrases in order to set a precedent that abortion can be exempt in another trial under those circumstances. Now, why would she do that? Well, she is a reproductive healthcare professional. Now, I'm not suggesting that all she cares about is making money. However, you can't deny that if you win a court case that sets a standard that could financially benefit your profession, you might be a little incentivized to try to do so. Because when lawsuits happen, they do take those lawsuits into consideration for future trials. Based on that, I can say with 100% certainty that someone involved, whether it was the lawyer or it was the doctor, suggested that it was said in that specific way. Because the lawyer would have let the doctor know that they couldn't be in trouble for perjury because of the idea that the doctor is the one that holds the determination of what reasonable medical judgment is, and not the state. Remember this, he is a lawyer, so he knows all the stuff that I'm talking about, if not more. He knows they don't even need to be at trial, let alone what can be considered perjury. Now, you might be wondering why the judge approved of the procedure knowing the circumstances presented in the court didn't meet the standards required by the abortion ban. Well, this is a very simple one. She's a Democrat, and she believes she's making a change in some way, and that she is using her authority to wrong the rights that our society, not based on due process, not based on what's allowed, but based simply on the passion of what is right in her mind and what she believes should be the due process, specifically stating that she revokes the authority of the Attorney General to enforce the law. Here's the problem with that. The problem with that is that's not how the law works. You see, the thing about Republicans, whether you like them or not, is that they are way better at using the law than Democrats can even imagine. Now, this isn't on the merit of morality, but on the merit of how the law works. Republicans know how to make laws better than Democrats do. They know how to uphold laws better than Democrats do. They know how to change policy instead of undermining policy with other policy the way that Democrats do. But mostly, they know how to make sure the law doesn't get too complicated. And this brings me to Ken Paxton. Paxton is a Republican, and Republicans, more than Democrats, are very, very persistent at upholding the fundamental formality with how our laws work. For him to allow this to go unchecked and not reevaluated would be against his political obligations as a representative of not only the state of Texas, but as the Attorney General, but also as a representative of the United States and how the laws are supposed to be managed and processed and upheld. This all has to be done despite his personal bias on the law. This has to be done despite your political party. However, we see more leniency on Democratic side because of their willingness to purposefully or sometimes incompetently pass a law that they personally agree with in a way that is tyrannical and illegal and justify it with the falsehood that although it was accomplished in a way where it could be detrimental and compromising to future standards on what our legal processing should be because they feel the morality of the law outweighs the lack of legality it took to put there. And that is somehow a step in the right direction of our country and how it should be ran. The fact of the matter is, Ken Paxton did not deny Kate Cox the access to abortion as a health care issue. He denied the outcome of the lawsuit, which was the exemption of the abortion ban on standards that weren't within the confinements of the law. And the reason why he was threatening her and everyone involved with legal recourse was to prevent this from becoming something that could be misconstrued to undermine the law that is already established by using a courtroom in the jurisdiction of that law to try and manipulate how the processing works when it comes to that. He wasn't going to allow a case that exempts someone from the law that is established based on something that wasn't presented by the law in the legal system that is supposed to uphold that law. I understand if you don't agree with abortion regulations, and that's not what this is about. This is supposed to be the standard for every law in our country, despite the controversy that might come with it. Another reason he did this actually benefits Kate Cox. It was also setting a precedent on that when a doctor isn't sure what reasonable medical judgment is, a judge, which is an elected official of our government and not a doctor of medical profession, has the final say on what a medical emergency for an abortion entails. When the law that he is trying to protect from being manipulated suggests that the government and courtrooms are not to make that kind of decision. I don't think it's in anyone's best interest for that to be the precedent on women's health care, especially if you believe the Republican Party is against women's health care, because the state of Texas is mostly Republican. So this would only make it so that whenever that judge, which the most cases would be a Republican, gets to determine whether or not you can get an emergency life-saving abortion. So if you actually believe that Ken Paxton truly wants to have control over women's healthcare access, don't you think that allowing this to happen would be something that he would like to happen? Lastly, we got the scum of the earth, Molly Duane. To Molly, Kate is just another sob story that she could use in order to run her organization of manipulation and deception. Now, I'm not claiming that her organization to help women get access to abortion is a bad organization, but what's going on here in Texas with these 20-plus clients all seems to share the same pattern of what's going on and asking the court permission to obtain access to an abortion in an emergency situation. She's a lawyer. She knows that going about it this way is going to lead to these women not getting approved for the access to an abortion. What's actually going on is the court is just not have the authority to give someone permission to an emergency abortion. So the outcome is that they deny them permission, which doesn't mean they don't have it. It just means that they're not allowed to give it, which means it is then misconstrued to her clients into thinking that they've been denied some access when the courts are just not allowed to authorize it in the first place. Molly hit the jackpot with Kate. You see, with all these other clients, it was rejection after rejection, but this time she got lucky because the judge decided to unlawfully grant her the permission, which led to the Attorney General pausing the permission, which made it look like a direct attack towards women's reproductive rights, which just isn't the case, and she knows it. The fact that these poor women don't have as much knowledge on the law and turn to her for advice just for her to convince them that they are practically second-class citizens by misconstruing the law and the proper proceedings in order to make her organization look better at the expense of these women makes me sick to my stomach. Kate Cox spent 3 days in agonizing pain under the false assumption that she was denied health care because they advised her to sue the state, got her hopes up by winning the trial, which was immediately struck down because the trial was reconsidered, which led to emotional and physical trauma where she had to sit there for 3 days instead of just getting the abortion in the first place, and then having to go to another state to seek medical help because she was awaiting a lawsuit and couldn't get one under the threat of an arrest on a lawsuit that she really has no knowledge about. How dare you, Austin Kaplan, and how dare you, Molly Duane, take advantage of someone who is in mourning and in need of medical attention in such a careless way just to make yourself look good and to expand your profession. And to Kate Cox, I wish you and your husband and your whole family all the best, and I truly apologize for what has happened to you. This has been a terrible, terrible experience. And to those lawyers, Austin Kaplan and Molly Duane, if hell exists, you're going there. And if I somehow find myself to be there one day too, I call dibs.